On a Saturday morning in late September of 2003, a woman named Colette Marchand stood in the gravel driveway of her father's property outside of Timmins, Ontario, and watched a man in a yellow vest put price stickers on things her father had spent 40 years building. The estate sale company had arrived at 8 in the morning with 2 vans and a folding table and the kind of cheerful efficiency that people develop when they price other people's lives for a living. They moved through the workshop with clipboards and cameras, picking things up and setting them down, making notes without stopping to look carefully at anything. Colette watched from the doorway. She had driven up from Sudbury the night before. She had not slept well. She had $340 in her wallet, which was what she had been able to pull from the bank machine on her way out of the city, and she was standing there trying to calculate whether it was going to be enough. It wasn't, not even close. Let me tell you why. Let me tell you about Henri Marchand first, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what his daughter found on that workbench. Henri Marchand had come to the Timmins area in 1958 at 22 years old, following his uncle north from Hearst with a second-hand truck and enough French and enough stubbornness to make a life in the rock and spruce country of northern Ontario. He had worked in the bush camps for 3 years, saved what he could, and in 1961 had bought a 40-acre parcel outside of town on a gravel road that went nowhere particular, with a small house and a barn that needed a new roof and a reputation for being land that nobody else had wanted. Henri fixed the roof himself. He cleared 12 acres and ran a small beef operation and supplemented his income by doing mechanical work for the farms around him, because Henri Marchand could fix anything with an engine in it, and everyone within 20 kilometers knew it. That was the thing people remembered about Henri. Not that he was the biggest farmer, not that he had the most land. What they remembered was that if your equipment broke down at the wrong time, the middle of seeding, the height of hay season, the week before the ground froze, Henri Marchand was the man you called, and he came, and he fixed it, and he charged you what the parts cost and not much more, because he was not doing it for the money. Henri died in the spring of 2003 at 67 years old. His heart gave out on a Tuesday evening in May. He had been in the workshop, apparently, because that was where his neighbor Armand Tessier found him the next morning when he came over to return a hydraulic jack he had borrowed the previous autumn. Armand said later that the workshop lights were still on and the kerosene heater was still running, and Henri was sitting on a stool at the far end of the bench with a magneto in his hands, which was not a bad way to go if you had to go, but which was also the kind of thing that takes a long time to stop thinking about. Colette was the youngest of 3 children. She was 44 years old in 2003, and she lived in Sudbury, where she worked as a civil engineer for the regional municipality. She was good at her work. She had her father's patience with complicated systems and her mother's ability to talk to people, which was a combination that had served her well in a profession where most problems were technical on the surface and human underneath. But she had not spent much time at the farm since her mother had passed in 1996. She had come up for Christmas when she could manage it, and she had called her father on Sundays, and she had believed, in the comfortable way that people believe things they cannot afford to examine too closely, that there would be time later to sit with him properly and learn what he knew. There was not time later. There rarely is. Her brother Etienne and her sister Carol had no interest in the property. Etienne lived in Toronto and worked in finance and had not owned a pair of work boots in 20 years. Carol was in Vancouver and had made her feelings about northern Ontario winters plain on many occasions. The farmland, what little there was, had already been sold to a neighboring operation the previous year, a fact Henri had arranged quietly and without consulting anyone, because Henri Marchand was the kind of man who solved problems before other people knew they existed. What remained was the house, the barn, the workshop, and the 40 years of accumulated work inside it. The estate sale company had been Etienne's idea. He had found them on the internet and arranged everything by email, and had not driven up from Toronto to be there, because he had meetings he could not reschedule. Colette had come because she could not come. She did not have a clear reason. She just knew that if she was not there when her father's workshop was priced and catalogued and sold off to strangers, she would not be able to explain to herself afterward why she had stayed home. Let me tell you about the week before the sale, because that is where this story actually starts. Colette had driven up on the Friday before the sale to spend the weekend going through the farmstead. She had expected it to be hard in the ordinary way, sorting through a parent's things, deciding what was memory and what was just old furniture. She had not expected to walk into the workshop and feel the floor shift under her. Henri's workshop was a long, low building he had built himself in 1969 out of concrete block and steel roof panels, with a wood stove at one end and a drain in the center of the floor and two fluorescent light fixtures that hummed when you turned them on. It smelled like machine oil and wood smoke and cold concrete, and something underneath that Colette could not name but that she had always associated, without thinking about it too directly, with her father. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she went in. The workbench ran along the south wall for the full width of the building. Above it on pegboard that Henri had painted gray hung tools on hand-bent hooks, each hook labeled in her father's careful block printing with a black marker directly on the pegboard. Every tool had a place. Every place was filled. Colette had seen this before in her childhood, had taken it for granted, as a child takes for granted anything that has always been there. But standing in the doorway as an adult with her father 3 months dead, the precision of it stopped her in a way it never had before. It was what was on the bench itself that she was not prepared for. Laid out across that surface, in organized rows on pieces of clean cloth, was a collection of small mechanical assemblies that Colette recognized in general terms from her engineering background, but could not immediately place in specific context. There were carburetors, old ones, disassembled carefully into their component parts and arranged in sequence. There were magnetos of different sizes and configurations. There were fuel pump bodies and governor housings, and a row of small precision components she could not immediately name. At the left end of the bench, in a fitted wooden case her father had built from what looked like birch, was a set of measuring instruments, micrometers, and bore gauges and feeler gauges that were cleaner and more precisely organized than anything Colette had seen outside of a professional calibration lab. She walked the length of the bench. She picked things up and put them down. She opened the drawers below the bench and found more components, sorted into hand-labeled compartments made from cardboard boxes cut to size. She found in the bottom drawer at the far end a stack of notebooks. 6 of them, hand-published notebooks with black and white covers, the kind you can buy at any pharmacy. She took them to the stool at the end of the bench and sat down and opened the first one. Henri Marchand had been keeping records. Not just notes, records. In his careful block printing, in pencil, with occasional diagrams drawn in the margins, her father had documented every piece of equipment he had worked on for the better part of 4 decades. What the problem had been, what he had found when he opened it up, what he had tried, what had worked. What had not worked and why it had not worked, which he was careful to explain in detail, because, as he wrote in the front of the first notebook, the things that don't work teach you more than the things that do, if you take the time to understand why they didn't. Colette sat on that stool for nearly 3 hours. She read the first two notebooks completely and started the third. She was a civil engineer. She understood systems and tolerances and the logic of mechanical failure. She understood what she was reading, and what she was reading was not the hobby notes of a farmer who liked to tinker. What she was reading was the accumulated diagnostic knowledge of a man who had spent 4 decades developing, through pure practice and careful observation, an understanding of the ignition and fuel systems of agricultural and bush equipment that most professional mechanics never approached. Henri had not been fixing his neighbor's equipment out of goodwill alone, though he had been doing it out of goodwill. He had been, in the most deliberate sense, learning. Every repair was a lesson. Every failure was a data point. He had worked on equipment that dated back to the 1940s and forward to the 1980s, tractors and bush machines and generators and portable mills, and he had documented all of it with the patience of a man who understood that knowledge is only permanent if you write it down. Colette sat in the workshop until the light changed and she realized she had not eaten since morning. Then the estate sale company came. They arrived Friday afternoon to do an initial walkthrough before the Saturday sale, 2 people with a tablet computer and a pricing gun, and they moved through the workshop with the pleasant efficiency of people who have done this many times and who know, from experience, approximately what things are worth in aggregate. Colette watched them work. She watched one of them pick up a magneto, turn it over twice, and set it back down. She watched the other one open the nearest drawer, look at the sorted components inside, and close it again without picking anything up. She watched them consult quietly together. She watched them put a single price on the entire bench, everything on it, everything in the drawers below it, the measuring instruments in the birch case, the 6 composition notebooks. $300. The whole everything. Colette looked at that sticker for a long moment. She was a civil engineer with 20 years of professional experience. She was the daughter of a man who had spent 40 years developing knowledge that she had now spent 3 hours beginning to understand. She knew what the measuring instruments alone were worth. She knew what a restorer would pay for some of the older components. She knew, more importantly, what was in those notebooks, because she had read enough of them to understand that they were not parts records. They were a manual. A manual that did not exist anywhere else, for equipment that was now old enough that the people who had originally serviced it were mostly gone. She did not say any of this to the estate sale people. She said she would be at the sale in the morning. She went back to the house and sat at her father's kitchen table and thought about it for a long time. Let me tell you about the morning of the sale, because it did not go the way Colette had expected. The sale drew about 50 people, which was a reasonable turnout for a farm estate in the Timmins area on a cold Saturday in late September. Most of them were there for the household goods and the small tools, the practical things that move at estate sales, extension cords and hand tools and kitchen equipment, and the kind of furniture that is solid and unfashionable and therefore useful. A few were there for the larger equipment, the tractor and the portable generator and the log splitter, which attracted the attention of men who had driven some distance and who were examining things with the seriousness of people who intend to use them. The workshop contents were scheduled for mid-morning. Colette positioned herself near the bench early. She had been at the sale since it opened at 8, and she had been watching. She was not the only one watching the bench. There were 2 other people she had noticed. One was a heavy-set man in his 60s in a Carhartt jacket, who had walked the full length of the bench twice already and spent longer at the measuring instrument case than anywhere else. The other was a younger woman, maybe 35, with short hair and work-worn hands and a canvas bag over her shoulder, who had been back to look at the notebooks 3 times. People who come back to look at something 3 times at an estate sale are not casual browsers. Dollars. The estate sale company got to the workshop bench at 10:20. Colette knew the exact time because she checked her phone when the auctioneer said, "All right, let's move to the workbench and everything associated with it," and the time stuck in her mind the way specific details stick when you are paying very close attention. Dollars. The auctioneer described the lot in the broad terms of a person who knows they are not the expert in the room. Assorted engine components, magneto assemblies, carburetor parts, precision measuring instruments in a wooden case, and a collection of maintenance notebooks. He opened the bidding at $75. The man in the Carhartt jacket bid immediately. Colette bid, the younger one with the canvas bag bid, the man bid again. Colette bid, the woman with the canvas bag bid again. The man dropped out at $225. The woman looked at Colette. Colette looked at the woman. The auctioneer called for $250. The woman bid $250. Colette bid $300. The woman looked at the bench. She looked at Colette. She looked at the bench again. Colette did not look away. She was not trying to communicate anything specific. She simply did not have anywhere else to look, because there was only one place in that entire sale that mattered to her, and they both knew it. The woman did not bid again. The gavel came down at $300, which was exactly to the dollar what Colette had in her wallet. She loaded the bench contents into her truck that afternoon. The components, the measuring instruments in their birch case, and the 6 compositions notebooks, which she put in the cab beside her rather than in the bed of the truck, because it had started to rain and she was not taking any chances. She drove back to Sudbury and carried everything into her house and set it in the spare room and went to bed. Let me tell you what Colette Marchand did in the 3 months after that sale, because it matters more than the sale itself. She had a demanding job. She worked long hours and managed a team and had the particular kind of fatigue that comes not from the work itself, but from the endless negotiation between what the work requires and what the people around you are willing to do. She did not have a great deal of spare time, but in the evenings, after dinner, she started reading. She read the notebooks the way you read something that requires your full attention. Not quickly, not in sequence necessarily, but carefully, going back to earlier entries when a later one referenced something she had missed. She made her own notes in a separate pad. She looked up equipment she didn't know, in books she ordered online, and in library resources she had not used since graduate school. She brought her engineering background to the notebooks the way you bring a flashlight into a space you've entered in the dark. And what the light showed her was a body of knowledge that had no equivalent she could find anywhere in the existing technical literature. Henri Marchand had worked out solutions to specific mechanical problems, problems with the ignition timing of particular engine configurations, problems with fuel delivery in cold weather starts, problems with governor response in high-load conditions that were not documented in any service manual she could locate. He had worked them out by trial and error over decades, with the specific equipment available to him in Northern Ontario in conditions that were specific to Northern Ontario. -30 starts, gummed fuel from storage, components that had been repaired by people who were themselves improvising, layered repair on repair until the original fault was buried under years of workarounds. Henri had not solved generic problems, he had solved northern problems, and he had written down exactly what he had found and exactly what had fixed it. By December, Colette had read all 6 notebooks twice. She called a woman she knew professionally, an engineer named Bernadette Quenville, who ran a small equipment restoration business in New Liskeard, about 2 hours north of Sudbury. Colette had met Bernadette at a regional infrastructure conference years earlier and had stayed loosely in touch. She told Bernadette what she had found. Dollars. Bernadette was quiet for long enough that Colette checked the line to make sure it was still connected. Then Bernadette said, "Can you bring those notebooks here? I want to see them." Dollars. Colette drove to New Liskeard on a Saturday in January. Bernadette read through the notebooks at her kitchen table while Colette drank coffee and looked out the window at the frozen lake and waited. Dollars. Bernadette did not say much while she was reading. She turned pages slowly and occasionally stopped to make a note of her own. Once she put a notebook down and picked up a different one, dollars, flipping to a specific entry as though she had remembered something she needed to check. Dollars. When she finished, she sat back and looked at Colette and said, "Your father solved the cold start lean condition on the early cockshut diesels. You know how many people have been trying to sort that out? I've had 3 of those engines through my shop. I sent them all away unsolved." She paused. "This is not in any documentation I have ever seen. This is something he worked out himself." Dollars. Colette said she had started to understand that. Dollars. Bernadette said, "What are you going to do with this?" Dollars. Colette said she was still figuring that out. Bernadette said, "Don't let it sit in a box." Dollars. Let me tell you about the decision Colette Marchand made in the winter of 2004, because it surprised her more than it surprised anyone else. Dollars. She had been with the municipality for 18 years. She was good at the work. She had a pension accruing and a position that had taken years to build, and colleagues who respected her and a salary that made her life in Sudbury comfortable and stable. She was 45 years old, and by any reasonable accounting she was settled. Dollars. She was also aware, in the way that middle age makes you aware of things you have been politely ignoring, that she had spent 18 years solving problems that other people would never know had existed. Road drainage, stormwater management, culvert sizing, important work. Work that mattered. Work that left no particular trace once it was done correctly. Dollars. She had never, in all that time, felt the thing she had felt sitting on the stool at the end of her father's workbench, reading his notebooks in the late afternoon light of a September workshop. The particular quality of attention that means you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Dollars. She gave notice in February of 2004. Dollars. She spent 3 months converting the workshop on her father's property into a working space. She kept the bench in its original configuration along the south wall. She hung her own tools on the pegboard above it, dollars, on hand-bent hooks, and she labeled each hook in block printing with a black marker directly on the pegboard. She did not do this deliberately in imitation of her father, dollars. She did it because it was the logical way to organize a workbench, dollars. She noticed the similarity later, standing back to look at what she had done, and she stood there for a few minutes with that fact. Dollars. She opened Marchand Equipment Restoration in May of 2004 from her father's workshop outside of Timmins, dollars, specializing in the diagnosis and repair of ignition and fuel systems in agricultural and bush machinery from 1940 through 1975. She had 4 clients in the first month, dollars, all of them referrals from Bernadette Quenville. She had 9 in the second month. By the end of the first year, there was a waiting list. Dollars. Let me ask you something because I want you to sit with this for a moment before the story continues. Dollars. Colette Marchand spent $300 at an estate sale. She spent 18 years at a career that was respected and comfortable and not quite right for her. She spent the better part of a year learning what her father had spent 40 years building, and in exchange she got a life that fit her in a way the previous one never quite had. Dollars. That is not a story about a lucky find at an estate sale. That is a story about a woman who understood what she was looking at when no one else did, and who was willing to make the kind of decision that looks reckless from the outside and feels, from the inside, like the first thing you've done in years, that makes complete sense. Dollars. But the estate sale is not where the story ends. Let me tell you about the woman with the canvas bag, because she has one more part to play in this. Her name was Théodore Villeneuve, and she was 36 years old in the fall of 2003, and she ran a small engine repair shop in Kapuskasing, about 2 hours north of Timmins. She had grown up on a farm in the Cochrane area and had learned basic mechanics from her grandfather and had built the shop over 8 years from a one-person operation into a business with 2 employees and a reputation for honest work and fair pricing, which in a small northern town is a reputation worth having. Théodore had heard about the Marchand estate sale through the local network of people who move in the world of old equipment. She had driven down from Kapuskasing on a Saturday morning because she had heard secondhand that there was a collection of early ignition components and some documentation that might be useful. She had arrived with a canvas bag and a budget of $250 and the methodical attention of someone who has learned to evaluate things quickly. When she had stood at the workbench and looked at the notebooks, she had understood that they were significant without being able to assess precisely how significant. She had not had time to read them, only to look at a few pages and understand that they were detailed and organized and written by someone who knew what they were doing. When the bidding went past $250, she had stopped because she was at her limit, and because the woman bidding against her had a look that Théodore recognized, the look of someone for whom this is not optional. Théodore thought about that estate sale for months afterward. She thought about it during repairs that stumped her, and during long drives between service calls, and in the particular way you think about things that are nudging at something you haven't figured out yet. Let me tell you about the Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 2006 when Théodore Villeneuve drove to Timmins. She had heard about Marchand equipment restoration from 2 different customers in the same month. The first was a farmer north of Timmins with a 1958 Massey Ferguson, whose governor had been replaced twice by Théodore's shop and was still surging under load. She had sent him to Colette because she was out of ideas. He had come back 2 weeks later with the tractor running cleanly and had told her the problem had been a worn metering valve seat in the fuel injection pump, a fault specific to that engine configuration in cold climate applications that was not described in the standard service documentation. The second was a logging contractor with a 1965 skidder that nobody in the region had been able to start reliably below -25. Colette had solved it in 10 days. Théodore drove to Timmins and found the shop on the second try. A converted workshop on a gravel road, hand-painted sign, 2 old tractors parked outside with their hoods up. She went in. Colette was at the bench, working on something Théodore could not immediately identify, and she looked up but did not stop working. Théodore said she had sent 2 customers and was hoping to talk. Colette said she was glad they had come in. Théodore looked at the workbench. At the components laid out on clean cloth, the tools on their labeled hooks, the notebook stacked at the end of the bench. She recognized the organization. She had stood at a bench like this in September of 2003 at an estate sale in this same county and had almost bought it for $250 and hadn't. She said that's Henri Marchand's setup. Colette set down the tool she was holding. She said it is. There was a pause. Théodore said she had a skidder coming in next week with an ignition problem she had been unable to solve. She described the symptoms. Colette asked 2 questions about the timing advance mechanism and the ambient temperature at failure. Then she said the problem was probably the primary coil winding on the magneto losing resistance at cold temperatures, a failure mode specific to a particular run of magnetos from one manufacturer that had a documented winding defect but whose documentation was in a Finnish language service bulletin from 1968 that almost nobody had ever seen. She said her father had encountered it twice and had noted the diagnostic pattern. It looked like a timing problem. It was an insulation problem. Dollars. Theodore looked at her for a moment. She said, "How do you know it's the coil?" Dollars. Colette said, "Because that's what that skidder does when the coil is going. It starts fine above -15 and fails consistently below -20. The threshold is the coil." Dollars. The timing looks right because it is right when the engine is warm. The fault only appears under the specific resistance change that happens at that temperature range. Dollars. My father saw it in 1978 on a bush saw and again in 1984 on a different skidder. It's in the 4th notebook. Dollars. Theodore said, "Can you look at it?" Dollars. Colette said she could look at it the following Thursday. Dollars. The skidder came Thursday. Colette found the coil fault on Friday. The contractor called Theodore the following week to say the machine had started at -31 2 mornings, running without hesitation, which was something that had not happened in 3 years. Dollars. Theodore sent 7 more clients to Colette that year. She did not explain to her own customers why she was sending them south, because the explanation was complicated. What she told them was that there was a shop in Timmins that understood certain problems better than anyone else in the region, which was true and was enough. Dollars. What took Theodore longer and what mattered more in the end was what she did 6 months after that first visit. She drove back to Timmins on a Saturday and asked Colette if she could sit and read the notebooks. Dollars. Colette said yes. Dollars. Theodore spent most of a Saturday afternoon at the end of the bench reading. She did not say much. When she finished, she sat for a moment. Then she said, "Your father understood cold climate equipment failure in a way I don't think anyone else has ever documented." Dollars. Colette said, "I know." Dollars. Theodore said I should have bid higher at the estate sale. Dollars. Colette said, "Yes, you should have." Dollars. That was the most either of them said about the sale, and it was enough. Dollars. Let me tell you about what Colette Marchand built over the decade that followed, because the workshop outside Timmins was only the beginning. Dollars. By 2012, Marchand Equipment Restoration had a staff of 3 and a waiting list that stretched to 7 months. Colette had acquired, through estate sales and collector contacts, and a network that extended across northern Ontario into Manitoba and northern Quebec, what had become the most complete collection of cold climate, agricultural, and bush equipment documentation in private hands in the region. Dollars. She had also done something her father had never done, which was to organize his knowledge for an audience. Dollars. She spent the winters of 2009 and 2010 working through the 6 composition notebooks, cross-referencing them with her own shop records and with additional sources she had accumulated, and producing what she called a diagnostic reference for ignition and fuel systems of agricultural and bush equipment in cold climate applications. It was 312 pages. Dollars. She had it printed by a small press in Timmins and distributed it through Bernadette's network and through a mailing list of restoration contacts she had built over 8 years. She priced it at $50. The first printing of 400 copies sold out in 5 months. She printed 800 more. Dollars. She received letters and eventually emails from mechanics and restorers and agricultural historians across northern Canada and from parts of Alaska and the northern United States where the conditions and the equipment overlapped. Several of the letters said versions of the same thing, that they had been working on problems that the standard literature did not address, and that this reference had given them what they needed. Dollars. One letter came from a retired mechanic in the Northwest Territories who was 81 years old and who wrote that he had spent 50 years knowing things that nobody had ever asked him to write down, and that reading Colette's reference had made him start writing them down himself before it was too late. Dollars. The dedication page of the reference read, "For Henri Marchand, who wrote it down." Dollars. Let me tell you about the autumn afternoon in 2015 when a young man came into the workshop. Dollars. His name was Owen, and he was 23 years old, and he was Colette's nephew, the son of her brother Etienne, Dollars, who had sold his share of the Timmins property without visiting it, and who had been mildly baffled by Colette's career change since 2004. Owen had studied mechanical engineering at the University of Waterloo, Dollars, which was the same program his father had started and not finished, and which he had chosen for reasons he had not entirely worked out. Dollars. He had spent a summer at the shop when he was 17 doing whatever needed doing. He had not said much about it afterward. Dollars. Owen came into the workshop on a Thursday afternoon in October and sat down on the stool at the end of the bench, the same stool Colette sat on, the same position she had sat in reading her father's notebooks 12 years earlier, and said he had been thinking. Dollars. Colette said she was listening. Dollars. Owen said he had been looking at the electronic and hydraulic systems on the newer vintage equipment. Dollars. The late 1970s and early 1980s machinery that was now old enough to be giving restorers genuine diagnostic problems, but recent enough that the original engineers and technicians who understood the systems were still alive, Dollars, or had been until recently, and that the knowledge was dispersing without being recorded. He said there was a gap. Dollars. He said someone should be documenting it now before the people who understood those systems were gone. Dollars. Colette looked at her nephew for a moment. She thought about a Saturday morning in September of 2003 and a workshop and a sticker that said $300 and 6 composition notebooks that her father had written for no audience at all, and what it had cost to almost lose them and what it had taken to keep them. Dollars. She said, "You're right, there's a 1978 Versatile coming in next week with a hydraulic issue that's been through 3 shops. Work it with me and keep your own notes." Dollars. Owen said, "Just like that?" Dollars. "Just like that." Dollars. Owen spent 3 years working beside Colette and the 3 years after that working increasingly on his own. Dollars. And by 2022, he had begun a technical reference for the hydraulic and early electronic systems of Canadian agricultural equipment from 1972 through 1990. He dedicated it, when it was finished, Dollars, to his grandfather, Henri, whom he had never met, and to his aunt, Colette, and to the machines that had been patient enough to teach anyone who was willing to pay attention. Dollars. The shop is still outside Timmins. Owen runs it now. Colette stepped back in 2021 and spends her time the way her father spent his, in the workshop, working on old equipment, writing things down, charging people less than her time is worth because the understanding is the point, not the transaction. Dollars. Let me tell you one last thing because the story has one more turn in it. Dollars. Let me tell you about the woman with the canvas bag. Dollars. Théodore Villeneuve kept her shop in Kapuskasing. She kept sending clients to Timmins when she encountered problems she could not solve, and she kept coming down herself when she had questions. And over the years, she and Colette built the kind of professional friendship that forms between people who respect each other's work and do not need to make a great deal of noise about it. Théodore never joined the shop. She never asked to. Dollars. She had her own operation and her own clients and her own particular knowledge of the equipment and conditions specific to her part of the North, and she was building her own records. Dollars. In 2018, Théodore donated to the Timmins shop a collection of service documentation she had accumulated over 25 years in business. Finnish and Swedish equipment manuals, Canadian market supplements that had never been widely distributed, internal service bulletins from manufacturers that had gone out of business. Dollars. She drove it down herself in her truck and helped stack it in the back of the workshop, and when it was done, she stood in the shop and looked at the bench the way people look at things they recognize from a long time ago. Dollars. She said, "I've thought about that estate sale more than I should have." Dollars. Colette said, "What do you think about?" Theodore thought for a moment. She said, I think about how close I came to buying 40 years of someone knowing how to see what everyone else was missing, and not knowing that's what it was. Colette said, I didn't know either until I read the notebooks. Theodore drove back to Kapuskasing that evening. She kept her shop running until 2023, when she sold it to a younger mechanic she had trained over 5 years and retired to a house outside of Kapuskasing with a small workshop where she does, for the first time in her adult life, work that is entirely her own. She has been restoring a 1962 cockshut tractor. She keeps a notebook. It is not as detailed as Henri Marchand's notebooks, and it does not represent 40 years of accumulated knowledge, but it is specific and it is careful, and it is written in the voice of someone who has finally stopped working for the transaction and started working for the understanding. She is still writing in it. Some knowledge takes a long time to find the person it belongs to, and some things are only understood fully when you have been close to losing them and chose not to. I keep thinking about that sticker. $300 on a birch case and 6 composition notebooks and 40 years of a man's most careful thinking. I keep thinking about how close it came to being dispersed into the hands of people who would have used the parts and thrown away the notebooks, and how that almost happened not because anyone was cruel, but simply because they didn't know what they were looking at. That's the part that stays with me. Nobody in that story was a villain. The estate sale people were doing their job. Theodore was working within her budget. Even the man in the Carhartt jacket was just a person trying to find something useful at a fair price. The knowledge in those notebooks almost disappeared, not through malice but through ordinary inattention, the kind we're all guilty of when we look at something and see only its surface. What Colette did in that driveway in Timmins was something I think about in terms of what it actually costs to act on what you know. She had read 2.5 of those notebooks. She understood what she was looking at, and she spent every dollar she had brought with her because she understood that some things, once scattered, cannot be reassembled. That's not luck. That's a particular kind of honesty with yourself about what matters and what it's worth protecting. Henri Marchand spent 40 years writing things down for no audience. He charged almost nothing for what he knew. He never sought recognition for it. And I think there's something important in that. Not as a model of selflessness exactly, but as a demonstration of what it looks like when a person does work, because the work itself is the point. He was building understanding, not reputation. The notebooks were not a record of his success. They were a record of his attention. Colette had to find the courage to recognize that same quality in herself and to trust it enough to walk away from a career that looked correct from the outside. That kind of honesty takes something that isn't talked about enough, the willingness to sit with what you actually know about yourself and act on it even when the action looks reckless to everyone else. Etienne thought she had lost her mind. Maybe she had, in the best possible sense. And then there's Theodore, who came back, who kept coming back, who spent years sending clients she couldn't help to a shop run by the woman who had outbid her, and who eventually brought what she had accumulated and set it down on the same workbench she had almost bought for $250. That is its own kind of integrity, the willingness to set aside whatever prickliness might have been there and keep showing up to the work itself. The 3 of them built something that will outlast all of them, not because they planned to, because each one of them at a specific moment chose to act on what they knew was true rather than on what was convenient. Henri wrote it down. Colette came back for it. Theodore eventually brought what she had to add. I think that's how most of the things worth keeping actually get kept, not through institutions or grand gestures, through individual people deciding, one at a time, that something is worth the cost of paying attention to it. Owen has the notebooks now, all of them, and he's writing his own.